The morning sun filtered through the hills of the vast Vaughn estate. The early mist covered the stables and the green fields where horses galloped gracefully. To anyone else, this place was paradise, but for Rafaela, it was an open wound. From the bus seat, she watched the silhouette of the stables in the distance. Her heart pounded hard, as if every kilometer traveled brought her closer to a past she had tried to bury. She gripped the strap of her bag nervously. She had no choice. The job offer at the Vaughn ranch was her only option after months of fruitless searching. As she stepped down, the cool morning air wrapped around her. She stood still for a few seconds on the dirt road, taking a deep breath, reminding herself she was here for the horses, not for the man who owned them. A black truck stopped in front of her, kicking up a bit of dust. The window rolled down, and the stern gaze of a man met her eyes. Grey eyes like a storm, and an expression carved in stone. "You're late." Victor Vaughn's voice was cold, as sharp as a blade. His face showed almost no emotion except for a faint scowl of disapproval. Rafaela clutched her suitcase tightly and straightened her back. "My bus was delayed." He didn't respond immediately, just stared at her for a few seconds, as if evaluating her. Then, with a nod, he motioned for her to get in. The ride to the ranch was silent. The hum of the engine was the only thing breaking the tension between them. Rafaela looked out the window, watching the horses run across the pasture. That scene transported her back to her childhood, when her father used to take her to see the horses on this very property. But that was before everything changed, before the Vaughns destroyed her life. "I don't care if you have experience elsewhere." Victor's voice pulled her out of her thoughts. "Here, I make the rules. I don't tolerate mistakes or excuses. If you think you can't handle it, say so now, and I'll drop you off on the road." Rafaela met his gaze with determination. "I didn't come all this way to quit before I even start." He briefly turned his head toward her, and his lips curled into something resembling a smile, though it wasn't amusement, but a silent challenge. "Good. We'll see how long you last." When the truck stopped in front of the main house, a little girl around 6 years old came running toward them with a beaming smile. Her golden curls bounced with every step. "Daddy!" Victor's expression softened slightly as he knelt to receive the girl in his arms. "Emma, what are you doing out here so early?" "I wanted to see the horses before school," she said excitedly, then turned her big blue eyes toward Rafaela. "Who's she?" Victor let out a soft sigh before answering. "She's the new vet." Emma tilted her head and smiled. "I like vets. Are you going to take care of Estrella?" Rafaela felt a knot in her throat. Estrella. She remembered that mare perfectly. "Yes, I'm going to take care of her and all the other horses." Emma clapped her hands joyfully before taking her father's hand. "Then I like her." Victor said nothing, just motioned with his head for Rafaela to follow him as he walked toward the stables. The weight of the past pressed on her, but something in Emma's innocent smile gave her strength. She wasn't here for Victor, nor for the resentment still lodged in her chest. She was here for the horses, and maybe unknowingly for something more. The sound of hooves echoed strongly in the main stable arena. Rafaela watched from a distance as Victor rode his horse with impeccable skill, commanding each movement of the animal with a blend of authority and confidence. He wore a fitted dark shirt, with the sleeves rolled up, and black leather gloves that gripped the reins firmly. Each time he pulled them, the imposing black horse responded with precision, as if there were an unbreakable bond between rider and steed. It was a hypnotic image, but Rafaela forced herself to look away. She didn't have time to be distracted by a man who, though undeniably attractive, represented everything she resented. "Don't just stand there watching." Victor's voice pulled her from her thoughts. "If you're as good as they say, prove it." Rafaela pressed her lips together and stepped toward the pen where a chestnut horse, visibly restless, shifted uncomfortably. She had reviewed its medical history before arriving and suspected the problem wasn't physical, but stress-related. "I'm going to approach calmly," she said aloud, more to herself than to anyone else. The horse snorted nervously when Rafaela extended her hand, but she didn't rush. With slow movements and a gentle voice, she tried to soothe him. "Easy, friend. I'm not going to hurt you. Victor watched in silence from across the pen. His arms were crossed, his expression unreadable. The chestnut horse finally allowed Rafaela to touch its muzzle, and gradually its breathing settled. "It's not an injury," she murmured while examining him. "It's stress. He needs a more stable environment and a gentler routine." Victor raised an eyebrow, skeptical. "Since when do horses get stressed like humans?" Rafaela turned to face him. "Since always. If you treat them like mere competition tools, you'll never understand what they truly need." A tense silence settled between them. For the first time, Victor's eyes locked on hers with more attention than disdain. "Interesting theory. But here, horses are bred to compete. They're not pets. And even so, if you don't care for them properly, they won't win anything," she shot back firmly. Victor's gaze darkened for a moment, as if her words had touched a nerve. Before he could respond, Emma came running with a big smile on her face. "Daddy! Daddy! Estrella isn't eating again!" Rafaela felt a chill. The mare that had meant so much to her as a child was now sick, and it was her responsibility to save her. Victor barely reacted to his daughter's urgency. He turned to Rafaela with an expression that left no room for doubt. "Let's see if you're as good as you say." Without wasting another second, Rafaela nodded and headed toward the stable. She knew that from this moment on, every decision she made would be under Victor Vaughn's watchful eye. And even if she didn't want to admit it, part of her wanted to prove him wrong. The stable held a familiar scent: fresh hay, damp wood, and the unmistakable smell of horses. Rafaela entered with a steady step, but her hands trembled slightly when she saw Estrella in one of the stalls. The white mare, whose elegance had captivated everyone since her birth, was lying on the straw with her ears down and her breathing uneven. Her large, dark eyes looked at Rafaela with a hint of recognition, as if she still remembered her. "She hasn't been well for weeks," Emma said, worried. "Sometimes she seems better, but then she stops eating again." Rafaela knelt carefully and ran her hand over the mare's neck, feeling the warmth of her coat. A lump formed in her throat. "You look more tired than I remembered," she whispered quietly, more to herself than anyone else. Victor leaned against the stall door, arms crossed, watching her with a mixture of curiosity and distrust. "Previous vets found nothing conclusive," he said coldly. "I hope you've got more than just guesses." Rafaela ignored his tone and continued her examination. Patiently, she touched the mare's muzzle and noticed it was drier than normal. Then she checked her teeth and abdomen, feeling a slight stiffness in her muscles. "Has she been drinking less water lately?" she asked without looking up. Emma was the first to answer. "Yes. Sometimes she won't even go near the trough." Rafaela frowned and looked around. She stood and walked over to the water trough. She dipped her hand in and rubbed the water between her fingers. A moment later, her expression hardened. "Have you tested the water?" Victor let out an exasperated sigh. "Of course it's clean, but not its taste," Rafaela corrected, meeting his gaze. "There's something off about it." Victor frowned and stepped closer. He wet his fingers and tasted the water hesitantly. A second later, his expression changed. "It tastes metallic." "Exactly," Rafaela said. "There may be traces of excess minerals. If Estrella's been avoiding it, she's probably dehydrated, and that could explain her lack of energy." Victor stared at her for a long moment, and for the first time there was no arrogance in his face, but something close to admiration. "If you're right, this could be the key to the problem. We can run tests on the water, but for now I need to change her hydration source," Rafaela said decisively. "I'll also adjust her diet to compensate for the fluid she's lost." Emma smiled excitedly and approached the mare, gently stroking her muzzle. "Does that mean Estrella will be okay?" Rafaela returned the smile. "It means I'll do everything I can to make sure she is." Victor said nothing, just turned and walked out of the stable, leaving her to work. Rafaela sighed and turned her attention back to the mare. She had won a small battle, but she knew the war with Victor Vaughn was far from over. The early hours of the morning passed, with Rafaela focused on Estrella's care. She made sure the mare received enough hydration through a mix of natural electrolytes and prepared a special diet to help her regain strength. Emma, thrilled, didn't leave her side, asking questions and offering help at every opportunity. Victor, on the other hand, kept his distance, watching with his arms crossed, as if trying to decide whether or not to trust her. "You've got a good hand with horses," he finally murmured when the stable fell silent. Rafaela looked up, surprised by the comment. She hadn't expected praise, not even a hint of approval. "Thanks," she replied cautiously. "I learned it when I was very young." Victor tilted his head slightly, analyzing her words. "Where did you work before?" "I couldn't find much information about you when I checked your background." Rafaela felt a chill run down her spine. Of course he had looked into her. She wouldn't expect anything less from a man like Victor Vaughn. "Here and there," she answered evasively. "I focused on caring for competition horses, but I've also worked on small farms." He stared at her, as if unconvinced. "You don't seem like someone who just works here and there," he said, his tone suggesting he didn't believe her. "You're too precise in what you do." Rafaela held his gaze firmly. "Is that a problem?" Victor smirked slightly. "Depends. I don't like mysteries on my team." Before she could respond, Emma pulled on her father's shirt. "Daddy, can I show Rafaela my room before I go to school?" Victor looked at his daughter, then at Rafaela, as if internally debating something. Finally, he sighed. "All right, but don't take too long." Emma squealed with joy and grabbed Rafaela's hand, pulling her toward the house. Rafaela let herself be led, feeling a strange sensation in her chest. Victor was a complicated man, no doubt, but there was something in his gaze that unsettled her, as if he were trying to unravel who she really was. And she couldn't let him find out the truth. Not yet. Emma couldn't stop smiling as she guided Rafaela through the wide hallways of the Grand Vaughn house. The girl spoke excitedly about her favorite horses, her riding lessons, and how her father was the best rider in the world. "Daddy never lets anyone beat him," she said proudly while pushing open the door to her room. "He always says the Vaughns never back down." Rafaela paused for a moment upon hearing those words. She knew Victor was a man of strong character, but apparently that mindset ran deep in the family. Emma's room reflected her joyful spirit. Lavender walls, a small bookshelf filled with stories, and a bed covered in horse-shaped pillows. On the desk there was a framed photograph. Rafaela walked closer, curious. In the image, Victor held a younger Emma in his arms, while a dark-haired woman smiled at them from the side. "Is that your mom?" she asked gently. Emma nodded, though her expression dimmed slightly. "Yes, but she doesn't live with us anymore. She left when I was little." Rafaela noticed the sadness in her voice and gently ruffled her hair in an attempt to comfort her. "I'm sure she loves you very much, even if she's not here." The girl seemed satisfied with the answer and then pointed to a wooden box on the shelf. "Look at this. It's my treasure box." Rafaela took the box and carefully opened it. Inside were small objects that seemed like keepsakes. A horse's feather, a shiny stone, and among them, a rusty old horseshoe. Her heart skipped a beat when she recognized the item. It couldn't be. She took it in her hands, feeling its rough surface and the weight of memories crashing down on her like a storm. "Daddy says this horseshoe is special," Emma continued. "It belonged to a horse that was really important years ago. His name was Lightning." The world around Rafaela seemed to tilt. Lightning, the horse that had belonged to her family, the one her father had trained with devotion until, "Daddy says he was the best horse the ranch ever had, but one day he just disappeared." Emma's innocent voice continued, unaware of Rafaela's inner turmoil. "Do you think horses remember the people who loved them?" Rafaela could barely nod. Her fingers trembled around the horseshoe. It wasn't a coincidence. She had returned to this ranch for more reasons than she realized. And if Victor Vaughn discovered what she knew, nothing would ever be the same. Rafaela remained frozen in Emma's room, her heart pounding in her chest. The rusty horseshoe in her hands was a fragment of a past she had tried so hard to leave behind. Lightning wasn't just any horse. He was the symbol of the betrayal the Vaughns had committed against her family. She clenched her jaw, trying to control the emotions that threatened to surface. "Are you okay?" Emma asked, tilting her head curiously. Rafaela quickly pulled herself together, forcing a smile. "Yes, it just reminded me of something." Emma seemed satisfied with the answer and continued chatting about her other treasures, but Rafaela barely heard her. Her mind was trapped in the past, in the image of her father returning home with empty hands and a devastated face. "They took everything from us," he had said that night. "Not just lightning. They had lost stability, trust, and their future. And now, years later, fate had brought her back to the very place where it had all started. A knock on the door pulled her out of her thoughts. "Emma, go get ready for school," came Victor's firm voice from the doorway. Emma pouted slightly but obeyed. Before leaving, she gave Rafaela one last smile. "Will you tell me more about the horses when I get back?" "Of course," Rafaela replied, her voice still a little tense. When the girl disappeared down the hallway, Victor stepped inside with arms crossed and a gaze that made her feel cornered. "You didn't look too comfortable in there." Rafaela straightened her back, forcing herself to stay composed. "It was just an unexpected memory." Victor narrowed his eyes as if unconvinced. "Emma trusts you too quickly. That doesn't usually happen. Children tend to see what adults can't," she replied, matching his gaze. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he studied her in silence, as if searching for a crack in her facade. "I don't know what you're hiding, but let me warn you," he finally said, voice low and serious. "I hate liars even more than I hate incompetence." His words hit hard, but Rafaela didn't let her expression show anything. It was already too late to turn back, but she couldn't let Victor Vaughn discover who she truly was. Not until she uncovered the truth about what his family had done to hers. The wind blew hard as Rafaela stepped out of the stable at dusk. The day had been long, but Estrella was beginning to show signs of improvement. Despite her exhaustion, she felt genuine satisfaction seeing her efforts bear fruit. However, the conversation with Victor still echoed in her mind. "Don't try to play games with me." It wasn't an empty threat. He was suspicious of her, and he wouldn't stop until he found out what she was hiding. "Planning to stand there all night?" His deep voice startled her. She turned and found him leaning against the fence, watching her under the dim moonlight. "I was just enjoying the fresh air," she replied calmly, trying to appear unbothered. Victor didn't move. The night breeze ruffled his dark hair, giving him an even more intimidating aura. "You don't seem like the type of person who simply enjoys something," he commented with a half-smile, though his gaze remained inquisitive. "Why did you take this job?" Rafaela held his gaze firmly. "Because I'm a vet, and I care about horses." "Sounds good in theory," he said, taking a step closer, "but I get the feeling there's more to it." The silence between them grew heavier. Rafaela knew Victor was a persistent man, but this time his insistence had a different tone. "Why does it matter so much to you?" she finally asked. His grey eyes scanned her face with intensity. "Because, since you arrived, my daughter smiles more. My horses are doing better and I—" He stopped himself, as if unwilling to say what he was really thinking. Rafaela's heart raced. "And you what?" The tension between them was thick. Victor looked away for a moment, as if struggling with his own thoughts, then locked eyes with her again. "I don't usually trust people easily," he admitted. "But with you, there's something I can't quite explain." Rafaela felt a wave of guilt rise inside her. She shouldn't care what Victor felt. She couldn't afford to lower her guard. "Maybe not everything has to be analyzed or controlled," she murmured, holding his gaze. Victor took another step forward, and now the distance between them was almost non-existent. "And what am I supposed to do with that?" Rafaela's breath caught. She knew she was playing with fire, but for the first time she didn't want to step back. Before either of them could say or do anything more, a shout from outside broke the moment. "A horse got loose! We need help at the paddock!" Victor cursed under his breath and walked away immediately. Rafaela took a deep breath, regaining her composure, and ran after him. The tension between them would be put on hold, but not for long. The night sky stretched above the ranch like a dark blanket scattered with stars. Rafaela tried to focus on her work, but Victor's words kept echoing in her mind. "I'll find out." She clenched her fists, walking toward the stable where Estrella rested. She couldn't afford to let her guard down. Victor was smart, and if he kept digging, he would eventually uncover the truth. As she entered, she noticed the soft glow of the lamp illuminating Estrella's figure. The mare raised her head as soon as she saw her. "Seems like someone's not sleepy yet," Rafaela whispered as she approached, and gently stroked her neck. The mare snorted softly and rested her head against Rafaela's shoulder for a moment. It was a gesture of trust, and Rafaela felt a bit of warmth in her chest. "You talk to horses. Maybe one day they'll talk back." Victor's deep voice caught her off guard. She turned and saw him leaning on the stable door, watching her with that gaze that seemed to see right through her. "Always show up out of nowhere?" she asked with a touch of irony, trying to hide the effect his presence had on her. "Only when I want answers," he replied, walking slowly toward her. Rafaela's pulse quickened as he stopped just a few steps away. The soft light cast shadows across his face, highlighting his sharp features. "Still suspicious?" she shot back, raising an eyebrow. Victor smirked. "Only with people who appear out of nowhere and seem to know too much about my horses." The air between them grew dense. Rafaela knew Victor wasn't joking. He felt something didn't add up, and he wouldn't rest until he figured it out. But she couldn't let him win. "Maybe I'm just better at my job than you expected," she said with a calm she didn't fully feel. Victor watched her for a long moment before stepping even closer. "Or maybe there's something you're not telling me." His proximity made Rafaela hold her breath. It was a battle of wills, of secrets and silences. Finally, Victor stepped back and walked toward the door. "Don't make me regret hiring you," he warned before disappearing into the darkness. Rafaela exhaled the breath she'd been holding and leaned her forehead against Estrella's side. She couldn't fail. But it was becoming harder and harder to ignore the feeling that she was playing with fire. The midday heat wrapped around the ranch as Rafaela walked toward the barn to organize the horses' new feeding plan. She tried to focus on her work, but her conversation with Victor still echoed in her mind. "I'll find out." He was too close to the truth. Each of his looks was a challenge. Each word, a trap that pulled her deeper into dangerous territory. As she organized the first aid kit in the veterinary room, the sound of firm footsteps made her turn. She didn't need to look to know who it was. "Thought I'd find you here," Victor said in his usual deep and serious tone. Rafaela sighed and slowly turned to face him. "What can I do for you this time?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he watched her with that intense look that always made her feel exposed. "I want to know more about you." Rafaela felt a chill run down her spine. "You already know what you need to." Victor stepped inside the room. "No, I know what you've chosen to show me, and that's not enough." The silence between them thickened. Rafaela knew Victor was stubborn, but this time his insistence carried a different weight. "Why do you care so much?" Victor's grey eyes locked onto hers. "Because since you got here, my daughter smiles more. My horses are better. And he paused as if weighing the consequences of saying more. "And you what?" Rafaela asked. The tension between them was electric. Victor looked away for a moment, then returned his gaze to her. "I don't trust people easily," he admitted. "But with you, there's something I don't understand." Rafaela's heart beat faster. She wasn't supposed to feel anything for him. She was here for the truth, for her father's dignity, not for this. "Maybe because not everything needs to be analyzed or controlled," she murmured. Victor took a step forward, closing the distance between them. "And what am I supposed to do with that?" Rafaela felt her breath catch. But before anything else could happen, a shout came from outside. "A horse got loose! We need help at the paddock!" Victor cursed under his breath and quickly turned to leave. Rafaela followed, her pulse still racing. Whatever was happening between them had to wait, but not for long. The midday sun beat down over the ranch as Rafaela arrived at the paddock. The sound of hooves hitting the ground filled the air, loud, frantic. A black horse, wild-eyed and frightened, ran in circles, kicking into the air, while the workers tried in vain to corner him. Victor took off his jacket in one swift move and jumped over the fence with the agility of an experienced rider. "Clear the way!" he commanded with authority. Rafaela stood at the edge, admiring and worrying as Victor approached the animal with calculated movements. He didn't rush or yell. Instead, he moved calmly, like someone who knew horses better than people. The horse snorted, still uneasy, but his hooves no longer kicked with the same aggression. "I need the rope," Victor said, not taking his eyes off the animal. One of the workers turned to get it, but Rafaela had already grabbed one and was walking toward him with determination. "Here you go," she said, arriving by his side. Victor glanced at her, surprised by her quick thinking, but said nothing. He took the rope and, with a precise movement, looped it around the horse's neck. The animal resisted for a moment, but Victor held firm, murmuring calming words until little by little the horse began to settle. Rafaela exhaled in relief when the horse finally stopped struggling. "Well done," she commented, still feeling the adrenaline in her veins. Victor let out a short breath and wiped his forehead. "Nothing I haven't done before." But when he looked at her, his expression changed. There was something different in his eyes, a new intensity. "You knew exactly what to do," he said, analytical. "You moved with the confidence of someone who's handled horses like this before." Rafaela's heart pounded. "I told you, I've worked with competition horses." Victor took another step forward. "No, you haven't just worked with horses. You understand them, like someone who's lived with them forever." Rafaela felt the ground shift beneath her feet. He was too close to the truth. Before she could say anything, a voice interrupted the moment. "Mr. Vaughn, we need you to review a contract in the office." Victor sighed, clearly annoyed by the interruption, but never took his eyes off her. "I'll be there in a minute," he said. Rafaela used the distraction to regain her composure. "I'll check the horse to make sure he's not injured," she said, walking away. Victor didn't stop her, but his eyes followed her until she disappeared into the stable. Rafaela leaned her hands on the wooden stall, trying to catch her breath. It was getting harder and harder to keep her distance, and it was becoming very clear that Victor wouldn't stop until he uncovered who she really was. The sound of hooves pounding the earth still echoed in the stables as Rafaela finished examining the horse. Fortunately, he hadn't suffered any serious injuries, just a couple of scrapes that would heal quickly. She gently stroked the animal's back, feeling his breath still a bit ragged. "You were scared too, weren't you?" she whispered with a faint smile. The horse snorted and rested his head against her shoulder for a moment. It was a gesture of trust, and Rafaela felt a warm tug in her chest. "You really have a gift for this." Victor's deep voice startled her again. She turned to find him leaning against the stable door, that same intense gaze fixed on her. "I just try to understand them," she replied cautiously. Victor crossed his arms and stepped slowly into the room. "It's more than that. What you did today, it's not something you learn from books or part-time jobs." Rafaela's pulse quickened. "Still interrogating me?" He smirked. "Only when someone gives me reason to." The silence between them thickened. For the first time, Rafaela saw something new in his eyes. He wasn't just suspicious, he was curious. "Emma told me you found a horseshoe in her treasure box." Her body tensed instantly. "And she said it belonged to a horse named Lightning," he continued in a low voice. "According to the story I've been told, he disappeared years ago." Rafaela felt a lump in her throat. Victor tilted his head slightly, studying her. "Does that name mean anything to you?" The air grew heavy. Rafaela knew she was in danger. Victor was too close to the truth. "What do you want me to say?" she answered, trying to keep her voice steady. He stepped closer. "I want the truth." Rafaela held his gaze, feeling that the time to keep hiding was running out, but she couldn't surrender so easily. "The truth is, I'm here to do my job," she said firmly. "And I don't see what a horse that vanished years ago has to do with that." Victor looked at her for a long time, as if deciding whether or not to push further. Finally, he sighed and stepped back. "Someday, you'll tell me, Rafaela." His words didn't sound like a threat, more like a certainty, and that was the problem, because a part of her knew that sooner or later she wouldn't be able to keep hiding the truth. Rafaela walked out of the stable with her heart pounding. Victor's words had disarmed her more than she wanted to admit. "Someday you'll tell me." Those words hung over her like a sentence. Not even an hour had passed since their conversation, but her mind wouldn't stop spinning. She headed to the barn, searching for solitude to clear her thoughts. She placed her hands on an old barrel and closed her eyes, trying to calm herself. He can't know. Not yet. She had come to this ranch with a purpose, to find answers, to discover the truth about what had happened to her family. But she hadn't expected her heart to start betraying her. A noise behind her made her turn immediately. "Still hiding." Victor's voice was calm, but his presence filled the room with an undeniable tension. Rafaela exhaled slowly before answering. "I'm not hiding, I just needed a moment alone." He observed her in silence, then took a few steps until he was right in front of her. "You've been avoiding my questions for days," he said in a lower tone. "But I know there's something you're not telling me." Rafaela bit her lip, feeling the walls closing in. Why does it matter so much to you?" Victor's grey eyes scanned her face with intensity. "Because every time I look at you, I feel like I've seen you before." The air became dense. Rafaela felt a chill down her spine. "That doesn't make any sense," she muttered, looking away. Victor wasn't fooled. "Then tell me the truth." Rafaela swallowed hard. For years, she had imagined the moment she would confront the Vaughns, the moment she would reveal the injustice her family suffered. But she had never imagined that when that moment came, her heart would be torn. "You're right, Victor," she finally whispered, her voice low but firm. "My last name is Foster." He didn't seem surprised. "I knew it. But what you don't know is what your family did to mine." Victor's expression hardened. "Explain." Rafaela stepped forward, adrenaline coursing through her veins. "My father didn't just train Lightning. He raised him, cared for him from the moment he was born. And your family took him away." The silence that followed was deafening. For the first time, Victor had no immediate response. And for the first time, Rafaela felt the game had changed. The air inside the small veterinary room was suffocating. Rafaela could see in Victor's eyes that her words had struck him, but he still hadn't reacted. Finally, his jaw tightened, and his voice came out lower than usual. "That doesn't make sense." Rafaela let out a bitter laugh. "Doesn't make sense? Ask your family, Victor. Ask what they did to my father after he gave his life to this ranch." Victor frowned, his grey eyes analyzing every detail of her expression. "My father never told me anything about that." "Really?" Rafaela crossed her arms, her voice growing more intense. "Because mine did talk about the Vaughn. He told me how much he trusted you, how he devoted his life to training Lightning, only to be fired without explanation and left with nothing." Victor seemed to process her words in silence. Why didn't he say anything? Because the Vaughns were untouchable. My father was just an employee, and you kept everything. Victor's face reflected a mix of disbelief and something deeper. "Is that why you came here? For revenge?" Rafaela felt a knot in her stomach. "I came for the truth." Victor took a deep breath and looked away, as if trying to recall something buried in his memory. "If what you're saying is true, it is. Then I need answers just as much as you do." Rafaela's heart pounded. She hadn't expected that. She expected denial, anger, but not the doubt now visible in Victor's eyes. "I'm going to talk to the people who worked here back then," he said with determination. "I want to know what really happened." Rafaela looked at him with distrust. "And if you find out your family wasn't so honorable after all?" Victor held her gaze. "Then I'll admit you're right." Rafaela felt a chill. Victor Vaughn wasn't the enemy she had imagined, and that made him even more dangerous to her heart. The sun was beginning to set on the horizon when Victor left the veterinary room without saying another word. Rafaela watched him disappear among the stables with a mix of mistrust and a feeling she didn't want to acknowledge. She hadn't expected him to promise to investigate. She hadn't expected that. Instead of denying the truth, he would want to face it. She sighed and leaned her forehead against the shelf of medicine bottles. She couldn't afford to let her guard down, not after everything that had happened. But something in her chest whispered that maybe, just maybe, Victor wasn't like the Vaughn she had imagined. Hours later, with the sky painted in shades of violet, Rafaela stepped out into the back patio of the ranch for some air. The sound of crickets filled the silence, and for a moment the place seemed more peaceful than usual. Until she heard voices. She stopped behind a wooden post, her instincts telling her not to be seen. "I don't want excuses." Victor's deep voice was contained, but there was a dangerous edge to it. "I need to know the truth about what happened with the horse and with Foster." Rafaela's heart stopped. "Mr. Vaughn, that was a long time ago," answered an older man whose voice seemed vaguely familiar. "I don't care how long ago it was. I want names. I want answers." There was tense silence. Rafaela could hear dry leaves crunching under the man's shoes. "Look, your father was a businessman. He didn't share everything with the workers, but there's something you should probably know." Victor didn't respond immediately. "Speak." Foster wasn't fired for incompetence. He knew something he shouldn't have. A chill ran through Rafaela. What did he know? Victor asked, his tone lower than ever. The man hesitated. Something about Lightning's ownership documents. Something that could have changed everything. Rafaela felt her blood freeze. It was worse than she imagined. Lightning hadn't just been taken from her family. Something darker was hidden behind his disappearance. Victor let out a breath full of frustration. "What happened to those documents?" "I don't know," the man replied. "But if your father hid them, maybe they're still somewhere in the ranch." Victor said nothing for a moment. Then his voice turned colder. "If you're lying to me, I'll find out." The man didn't reply, and his steps faded into the night. Rafaela stayed hidden in the shadows, her heart pounding. Victor Vaughn hadn't just accepted the truth. Now he was searching for justice, and that changed everything. Rafaela remained motionless behind the wooden column, her heart racing in her chest. The old horseshoe in her hands was a fragment of a past she had fought so hard to leave behind. Lightning wasn't just any horse. He was the symbol of the betrayal the Vaughns had committed against her family. She clenched her jaw, trying to control the emotions rising within her. "Are you okay?" Emma asked, tilting her head with curiosity. Rafaela quickly forced a smile. "Yes, it just reminded me of something." Emma accepted the answer and kept talking about her other treasures, but Rafaela could barely hear her. Her mind was lost in the past, in the image of her father coming home empty-handed, devastated. "They took everything from us, not just Lightning. They had lost their stability, their trust, their future. And now, years later, fate had brought her back to the very place where it had all started." A knock at the door pulled her out of her thoughts. "Emma, go get ready for school," came Victor's firm voice from the doorway. Emma pouted, but obeyed. Before leaving, she gave Rafaela a smile. "Will you tell me more about the horses when I come back?" "Of course," Rafaela replied, her voice still a bit shaky. When the girl disappeared down the hallway, Victor stepped inside with arms crossed and eyes sharp as ever. "You didn't look too comfortable in there." Rafaela straightened her back, holding her composure. "Just an unexpected memory." Victor narrowed his eyes as if reading her mind. "Emma trusts you too quickly. That's not like her. Children tend to see what adults can't." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he studied her in silence, as though searching for the crack in her armor. "I don't know what you're hiding, but I'll warn you," he said finally, his voice low and firm. "I hate lies, even more than I hate incompetence." His words cut deep, but Rafaela didn't let her face show it. It was too late to turn back. But she wouldn't let Victor Vaughn discover who she really was. Not until she found out the truth about what his family did to hers. The hallway leading to Victor's father's office was covered in dust and silence. Rafaela felt a chill as she walked through the door with him. The room looked frozen in time. Dark wooden bookshelves still held old books. The large fireplace remained untouched, and on the desk sat a lamp coated in dust, waiting to be turned on. Victor ran his fingers across the surface of the desk, his expression tense with a hint of nostalgia. I haven't set foot in here since he died, he admitted in a quiet voice. Rafaela glanced sideways at him. She had never seen him like this, holding in so much vulnerability, but there was no time for sentimentality. If your father hid something, it wouldn't be in plain sight, she said, scanning the room. Victor nodded and began opening the desk drawers. Rafaela focused on the shelves, running her hands across the spines of books, looking for anything out of place. Minutes passed in silence, until Rafaela noticed something. An old grandfather clock stood in the corner of the room. Its dark wood contrasted with the rest of the furniture, and its hands were stuck at an exact time, 11:07. She frowned and approached, running her fingers along the glass face. "This," she murmured. Victor came closer. "What is it?" "It's frozen at an exact time. Could be just coincidence, or a clue." Victor studied the clock. "My father didn't believe in coincidences." Carefully, he turned the metallic face and heard a dull click. A faint creak sounded at the base of the clock. Rafaela held her breath as Victor pushed on the side of the furniture, revealing a small, hidden compartment. Inside, wrapped in a yellowed envelope, was a set of carefully folded papers. Victor picked up the documents, hands steady, but breath uneven as he read the first few lines. Rafaela saw the tension in his jaw and couldn't help but ask, "What do they say?" Victor closed his eyes for a moment before whispering, "That my family never owned lightning." The world seemed to stop. Rafaela felt her chest tighten. "What?" Victor clenched the papers. "These documents prove the horse belonged to your family, that my father altered the records to claim him as his own." The silence was deafening. At last, the truth had come to light. But what that meant would change everything. Rafaela remained still behind the wooden column, heart pounding. The old horseshoe in her hands was a fragment of a past she had tried so hard to bury. Lightning wasn't just any horse. He was the symbol of the betrayal the Vaughns had committed against her family. She clenched her jaw, trying to control the emotions welling up inside. "Are you okay?" Emma asked with innocent curiosity. Rafaela forced a smile. "Yes, it just reminded me of something." Emma returned to talking about her other treasures, but Rafaela could hardly focus. Her mind was lost in memories. Her father coming home empty-handed, his face destroyed by despair. They took everything from us. Not only lightning. They had lost their stability, their trust, their future, and now, years later, fate had brought her back to the place where it all began. A knock at the door snapped her out of her thoughts. "Emma, go get ready for school," came Victor's firm voice. Emma made a small pout but obeyed. Before leaving, she smiled at Rafaela. "Will you tell me more about the horses when I come back?" "Of course," Rafaela answered with a tight voice. Once the girl was gone, Victor stepped into the room with crossed arms and a gaze that seemed to dig through her thoughts. "You didn't look too comfortable in there." Rafaela straightened up. "It was just an unexpected memory." Victor narrowed his eyes. "Emma trusts you too quickly. That doesn't usually happen. Children often see what adults can't." He didn't answer. He just watched her, as if trying to read her. "I don't know what you're hiding, but let me warn you," he said in a low, serious tone. "I hate liars more than anything." His words struck deep, but Rafaela didn't let it show. It was too late to turn back, but she couldn't let Victor Vaughn find out who she really was. Not yet. The sunrise found Victor standing in his office, eyes fixed on the old files scattered across the desk. He had spent the entire night awake, going through documents, trying to find any trace of what his father might have hidden. Nothing. Frustrated, he ran a hand through his hair. He wasn't a man who believed in mysteries. For him, everything had a logical explanation. But this was taking him somewhere unknown. The sound of a knock broke his thoughts. "Come in," he said without lifting his gaze. The soft creak of the door revealed Rafaela's silhouette. "You look like someone who hasn't slept," she commented with arms crossed. Victor let out a breath. "I'm starting to think this damn mystery is going to drive me mad." She stepped closer, scanning the papers scattered around. "Did you find anything?" He shook his head. "Nothing useful, just horse sale records, maintenance bills, but nothing about lightning." Rafaela ran her fingers along the edge of one of the old documents. If your father really hid something, he wouldn't have left it somewhere obvious. Victor propped his elbows on the table and looked at her. So, what do you suggest? She took a breath. If something is hidden, it has to be where no one would think to look. Victor frowned, but then his eyes darkened with realization. My father's office. Rafaela blinked, surprised. It still exists? Yes. I haven't touched anything since he died. I never even bothered to look through what he left behind. Rafaela's heart began to race. Then that's where we need to search. Victor stared at her for a long moment. Something in his expression seemed to waver between past and present. Finally, he stood up. Let's go. Rafaela followed without hesitation, because inside that office might be the truth they had both been searching for all along. The hallway leading to Victor's father's office was cloaked in dust and silence. Rafaela felt a chill as she followed him through the door. The place seemed frozen in time. The dark wood shelves still held old books, the large fireplace sat untouched, and on the desk, a dusty lamp waited to be turned on. Victor ran his fingers across the surface of the desk, observing every corner with a mixture of tension and nostalgia. I haven't been here since he died, he admitted in a quiet voice. Rafaela glanced at him from the side. She had never seen him like this, vulnerable, reflective, but there was no time for sentiment. If your father hid something, it had to be somewhere he considered safe, she said, scanning the room. Victor nodded and began searching through the desk drawers. Rafaela moved to the bookshelves, running her fingers along the spines, looking for anything out of place. Several minutes passed in silence. Then Rafaela noticed something. An old grandfather clock stood in the corner of the room. Its dark wood contrasted with the rest of the decor, and its hands were frozen at an exact time, 11:07. Frowning, she approached and traced the glass face with her fingers. This, she murmured. Victor looked over and came closer. What is it? She pointed to the clock. It's stuck at an exact time. Maybe it's a coincidence, or maybe it's a clue. Victor studied the clock. My father didn't believe in coincidences. Carefully he turned the metal face and they heard a soft click. A faint creaking sound came from the base of the clock. Rafaela held her breath as Victor pressed the side of the clock, revealing a small, hidden compartment. Inside, wrapped in a yellowed envelope, was a stack of papers folded with great care. Victor picked up the documents, but his breathing grew uneven as he read the first lines. Rafaela saw the tension in his jaw and couldn't stop herself from asking, "What do they say?" Victor closed his eyes for a moment before whispering, "That my family never owned lightning." The world seemed to freeze. Rafaela felt her chest tighten. "What?" Victor clenched the papers in his hand. "These documents prove the horse belonged to your family, that my father falsified the records to claim him as his own." The silence that followed was overwhelming. At last, the truth had surfaced, but what that truth meant would change everything. Silence filled the office, as heavy as the dust that covered the old furniture. Victor held the documents with a mix of disbelief and restrained fury. Rafaela watched him, her heart thundering in her chest. "This is undeniable," he finally murmured, voice low. Rafaela felt a lump rise in her throat. Years of resentment, pain, and fighting for the truth. Now the proof was in his hands. "I've always known," she whispered. "My father knew, but no one believed him." Victor closed his eyes for a moment, then exhaled as if trying to contain a storm within. "They took everything from him," Rafaela continued, her voice trembling. "Not just lightning. His dignity, his passion, his whole life collapsed because the Vaughns decided they could do whatever they wanted." Victor looked at her with the weight of guilt clear on his face. "It wasn't me who did this, but it's your name on those papers." The tension between them was unbearable. For years, Rafaela had imagined this moment, confronting a Vaughn, proving her family had been wronged. But she never imagined that when the moment came, her heart would be torn. Victor took a deep breath and gripped the papers tightly. "I'm going to make it right," Rafaela frowned. "How?" He looked at her with determination. "I'm going to make this public. I can't change what my father did, but I can make sure the truth is known. Rafaela's chest tightened. That will destroy your family's name. Victor gave a bitter smile. Maybe it deserves to be destroyed. Her eyes widened slightly. Are you serious? Yes, he affirmed. If your family suffered because of mine, I can't keep living like nothing happened. The air between them shifted. Rafaela felt, for the first time, that the man standing in front of her was no longer her enemy, and that thought scared her more than any secret from the past. You have the right to Lightning. What's left of his legacy belongs to you. Tears welled in Rafaela's eyes. Finally. But a new doubt pierced her. If you do this, your reputation, your business, everything your father built. Victor stepped forward slowly. I've spent my whole life protecting a name that in the end was built on a lie. Maybe it's time to start over. Rafaela's heart pounded as he got closer. What happens after that? Victor looked at her with sincerity. I don't know, but I want to find out with you. Her defenses crumbled. For years she had thought she hated the Vaughns. But now, in front of her, stood a man who not only wanted to do the right thing, but wanted to do it for her. Without thinking, she reached for him and kissed him. Victor held her tightly, as if clinging to something he never wanted to lose again, as if she were his most important truth. The past couldn't be changed, but together they could write a different future, one where truth, justice, and love finally won. Months had passed since the truth came to light. Victor had made the documents public, facing criticism, scandal, and business losses, but he never looked back. Rafaela stood at the edge of the pasture, watching the horses run freely across the field. Among them, a young white colt with strong legs and a spirited heart galloped, full of life. Estrella had fully recovered, and not only that, she had given birth. The colt, whom Emma had named Hope, was the living symbol of the new chapter that had begun on the ranch. He has her eyes, Victor said, approaching slowly and stopping beside Rafaela. And her stubbornness, Rafaela added with a smile. They watched in silence for a moment, as the wind carried the scent of grass and freedom. You've done something incredible here, she said. Victor shook his head. We did it. Rafaela turned to look at him. His eyes no longer held suspicion or guilt, but peace. Emma ran through the field toward them, laughing, barefoot and happy. She hugged Rafaela's waist before pulling Victor by the hand. Come on, Hope wants to play. They laughed and followed the girl hand in hand while the sun set slowly behind the hills. The ranch, once marked by secrets and betrayals, was now a place of healing, of truth, and of love.